in events hosting. They hope to leverage these events into economic growth and the revitalization of undervalued neighborhoods. So Rio's leaders are adopting an extrospective posture in their management strategies and have in particular looked to Barcelona as a model for successful Olympics development. My discussion here focuses on a downtown waterfront area called, in Rio called Zona Portuária. The municipality has partnered with numerous institutions at a variety of scales in an attempt to create a gentrified landscape worthy of a globalized Olympic city. This focus on incorporating models and best practices deemed successful in other cities is based on an impulse to manage risk and project a sense of order onto the city. Despite extensive efforts to create a more predictable, organized urban milieu, unexpected events keep cropping up to disrupt this narrative of control over chaos. I'm also going to highlight ways in which the complex assemblage of actors involved in the city's redevelopment plans are not always well coordinated and at times may work at cross purposes. So Rio's leaders in the past 2 decades have adopted an entrepreneurial approach to urban governance. In the context of the projects of globalization and neoliberalism, there's a heightened concern for cities to be more competitive in capturing global finance capital and in attracting the so-called creative professional class. Strategies towards these goals include urban marketing campaigns, as well as the wholesale redevelopment of key districts. Entrepreneurial regimes treat urban space as economic growth engines. Cities need to be seen as safe for investment. An image of security and aesthetic appeal are prerequisites in the process of physical and discursive recreation of the city. So in the case of Rio, a set of enterprising goals are inscribed in the city's strategic plans, the first of which was released in the mid-90s, and they've come out every few years since then. I'm going to focus on 2 related strands that come out of these plans. One is a strategy of hosting mega events, and another involves the revitalization of waterfront areas. So in pursuing these goals, Rio has enmeshed itself in a complex transnational network of institutions with the expertise in delivering these kinds of mega projects. This assemblage of actors include property developers, consultants, local governments, and various bodies representing the international Olympic movement. Rio's leaders have aggressively pursued a mega event strategy for the city. The Olympics is the crown jewel in a sequence of major events that the city will be hosting between 2007 and 2016. It'll be the culmination of more than 2 decades of efforts to bring those games to the city. Rio was inspired to mount an Olympic bid in the mid-90s after Barcelona's experience with the 92 games quickly became a model for how a city can use mega events to reinvent itself as an economically vibrant global city. A cottage industry of sorts of mega events consultants emerged in Barcelona, and members of Brazil's Olympic movement tapped into this resource to help them put together a bid for the 2004 games. This first effort failed to make the cut, but eventually helped Rio win the 2016 games. So just the process of bidding helps create the necessary personal and institutional connections and capacities to mount a successful mega event. Relationships are forged, especially at the bureaucratic sort of mid-management level of planning agencies and consulting firms that are instrumental in pulling off these incredibly complex projects. A variety of actors representing government, industry, and civil society come together to form a bid committee. They produce plans detailing a vision for the games, including the logistics of finance, security, and transport. Venue locations in the host city are chosen carefully with these considerations in mind. So Rio's bid identified 4 clusters where events will be located. The bulk of the facilities are going to be centered in the western district of Barra da Tijuca. The locals compare this region to Miami Beach. It's a fairly recently developed postmodern landscape of gated condos and mega malls. Since 2009, when the original bid was announced, Rio's city and state governments have pushed to bring some of the Olympics development to an additional district, the Zona Portuária. They plan to establish a media village and technical operations center here that will eventually become a residential and commercial complex called the Porto Olímpico. So let's take a little closer look at this district. It's a large area situated directly north of Rio's central business district. It contains the present-day working-class neighborhoods of Saúde and Gamboa, as well as the favela known as Morro da Providencia. This shantytown is widely known as the first favela in Rio. In the 19th century, the port zone had many estates of wealthy merchants. It was a sort of nice, more or less middle upper class neighborhood. The neighborhood began to decline in fashion at the end of the 19th century as port infrastructure expanded into the area, and new neighborhoods south of the city center became fashionable among the elite. By the mid-20th century, the port zone was dominated mostly by light industry and government institutions. Industrial uses declined in the 70s and 80s as port facilities continued to expand northwards into the bay, and wharves and warehouses became underutilized. In comparison to the neighboring central business district, which remained relatively busy and prosperous, Portuária seemed undervalued, dangerous, and deserted. So in the 90s, the municipality began to produce plans for the redevelopment of the region. The city now has a set of comprehensive plans to rebrand Zona Portuária as Porto Maravilha, or Port Marvel. Many of these plans are modeled on other cities. Baltimore's Inner Harbor, Barcelona's Port Vel, and London's Docklands are just some of the examples that developers in Rio are trying to emulate. The governance structure involved in the redevelopment is similar to those found in these other cities. Rio's municipal government set up a corporation with the acronym CIADORP to coordinate the activities of hundreds of actors involved in the renovation of the district. The corporation is currently courting international developers to invest in the area. And much of the provision of public infrastructure has been contracted out to a private consortium of local construction and engineering firms, called the Concessionária Porto Novo. This is modeled after business improvement districts that have long operated in cities like New York and London. This body will be in charge of most of the public works, including traffic control as well as security measures in the district. The plans on the drawing board for Portuária incorporate a by-the-numbers list of features commonly seen in the gentrified landscapes of waterfront redevelopment districts in North America and Europe. So we have docks and warehouses being converted to entertainment, nightlife districts, with boutiques, and a cruise ship terminal. We have plans to dismantle an elevated freeway and to sink it underground. This would be followed by the introduction of light rail and bicycle paths. There's also an effort to bring in monumental buildings. The corporation hopes to build an art museum, aquarium, and something called the Museum of Tomorrow, which will feature sustainability and technology exhibits. The building is designed by Santiago Calatrava, who seems to be like the main go-to guy for this kind of spectacular global architecture. CIADORP is also pushing the development of the Porto Olímpico in the western part of the district. This will be a mixed-use complex of residences, offices, and a convention center. The master plan is by a local architect who worked closely with consultants from Barcelona to create a scheme modeled after that city's gentrified Olympic Port district. The city plans to situate a media village for the 2016 games here. And by the way, this is the Barcelona architect. This is the guy who won the Olympic Port competition. He happens to be the son of the guy who owns the engineering firm who's running the concession. So that's not a surprise. Okay. So Rio's leaders hope that the broadcast out of the media village in that Porto Olímpico zone will be full of sparkling images of a well-run event in an orderly and enticing city landscape. Much of the ability to attract investment to the port zone depends on good PR and being able to tell a convincing story about economic opportunities and urban revitalization. The Olympics are a major cornerstone of the storyline. The city is doing everything it can to rebrand itself as a Cidade Olímpica. The Games are meant to mark an inflection point in Rio's fortunes, a watershed moment when the city starts to recover from decades of economic decline and violence. Various organizations are working in conjunction with government agencies to put out this kind of boosterist material in the form of pamphlets, exhibitions, and even like academic publications. That's something put out by Elsevier. In this literature, civic leaders consciously compare Rio to other cities. They're pushing a master narrative of recovery from crisis, a rhetorical strategy that's been used in cities like Barcelona, London, and Chicago. So Rio's leaders are making it clear that Porto Maravilha will be the next success story in a long line of waterfront projects around the world. There's a reassuring tone embedded in these comparisons. By stressing that it's adopting best practices already proven successful elsewhere, the municipality is making the case that Rio too will be safe for investment. There's a heavy emphasis on improvements in security and on learning from other places in order to mitigate risk. This concern over learning by example and managing risk is not an obsession unique to Rio. By pursuing mega events, the city has opened itself up to complex protocols of knowledge transfer and risk assessment associated with the international Olympic movement. Any city that even bids for games has to enter a system of constant evaluation by the IOC, contingents from other host cities, and transnational consulting firms. One of the main goals of these auditing procedures is to make sure the process of hosting the Olympics and the delivery of the necessary infrastructure is as orderly and predictable as possible. So in some ways, they're being subject to a certain amount of sort of discipline from the outside. One aspect of Rio's urban fabric that's often seen as the greatest threat to the image of order is the presence of its favelas. The municipality has been working hard to re-narrate the favelas as not just a problem area, but also as urban assets. They're doing this through a combined strategy of military pacification, favela tourism, and infrastructure provision. So the impacts of these interventions can be seen in the port zone in the Morro da Providencia community. It's a particular focus because of its symbolic status as the first favela in Rio. One of the ways in which the city plans to claim control is to build a cable car system between the top of the hill and surrounding neighborhoods. The city's already been installing these highly visible cable cars and elevators in other districts to link these formal and informal areas. The cable car idea was inspired by a system implemented earlier in Bogota, Colombia, which Rio's mayor saw on a trip there. So there's this kind of transnational dissemination of even infrastructure type ideas. These cable cars make the favela seem more orderly and legible and frankly surveilled. This and a program of self-guided tours promoted by the state government tend to spectacularize the favelas and make them seem less threatening to outsiders. But in spite of best efforts to paint a picture of rational planning and the imposition of control over chaos, situations constantly arise to spoil the effect. Socio-technical assemblages in Rio are always full of surprises. There's consistent infrastructure breakdowns, such as the recent spate of manholes exploding throughout the city. In 2010 and 2011, more than 60 manholes randomly exploded, including in posh tourist districts, causing dozens of injuries and even a handful of deaths. A couple of months ago, these 3 office buildings suddenly collapsed right downtown, killing 17 people. This is attributed to unlicensed and badly managed renovation work. We also have the less dramatic, but also just as problematic, threat of strike of police officers in Rio and other cities just days before the start of Carnival. And then there's the usual problems with cost overruns and delays. So there's some rising doubts that the metro line to the Olympic venues out in Barra da Tijuca will be fully operational by 2016, for instance. So these signs of mismanagement and chaos get amplified in the global media because the city is now under intense spotlight. Every unexpected disaster, every sign of poor management gets refracted through this lens of mega events. The constant refrain becomes, what does this mean for the Olympics? The heightened scrutiny increases tensions between the various groups involved in the delivery of these projects. Competing interests are negotiated via formal contractual arrangements as well as more informal understandings. So one conflict that's arisen is the use of the Olympic brand name to market development in the port zone. The Porto Olímpico project was not part of the original bid for the Games. The IOC and the Brazilian Olympic Committee are mainly focused on the delivery of a smoothly run event. Urban revitalization per se is not their primary concern. This is one of the reasons why the bulk of the venues were to be placed in the more sort of wealthy and isolated district of Baja. But the mayor, the governor, and more localized growth coalition, right, have a stronger interest in using the Olympics as an agent of gentrification. While the port zone was not included in the original bid, the city lobbied hard to get a few ancillary venues moved to that area. So the IOC apparently only sort of reluctantly agreed to that change. Another issue is that Rio has branded itself as the Olympic City and is using the brand to highlight all kinds of projects that are not directly involved in the sporting events. So the IOC is famously sensitive about brand control, and technically the city shouldn't be using the brand to market non-Olympic developments. And according to a person I talked to in the local organizing committee, the Olympics brand managers are sort of putting up with it a little bit because it needs the cooperation of local government and wants to maintain good relationships. So the IOC builds prestige by opening up new territory to the Olympics. The Rio Games will be the first ones in South America. The emerging BRIC economies are seen as great places for corporate sponsors to seek growth opportunities. This is surely one of the reasons why the IOC awarded the Games to Brazil, Russia, and China over just a span of only 8 years. The International Olympic movement depends upon the cooperation of localities, and local governments in turn depend upon international players to put together these events. These groups are bound together through a formal system of contracts. At the same time, they can wriggle around this regulation via less formal tacit understandings. So you have some subtle dynamics at play here. So just to sum up, Rio is engaged in a complex transnational network of property development and event delivery. Its extrospective gaze is driven by the drive of local leaders to create a new narrative of order, security, and global influence for the city. These storylines, however, are constantly disrupted by unexpected outbreaks or chaos. This adds to a tension between the various players involved in the remaking of the city. So nevertheless, a successfully run event is seen as too great a prize to let the project as a whole fall apart. So the transnational mega events industrial complex, for good or for bad, continues to grow, link together far-flung actors in informal and formal, organized and haphazard ways. So I'll stop here, and I guess we'll take discussion later. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll have time at the end of each panel to offer up some discussion points and questions.
All right. I'm Joe Quick. I'm a second-year graduate student in the anthropology department. And what I'm going to be talking about here today is largely forward-looking. I was inspired to this topic by tourist art that I came across in Ecuador while I was traveling last summer. But then thanks to LACIS and the Tinker Knave grant, I'm going to be back there this coming summer to add a little bit more nuance to this. So a year ago at the LACIS Graduate Student Conference, I spoke about indigenous media. Although my focus in that talk was on more traditional forms of media, film, radio, television, and so forth, I suggested that the concept of indigenous media could be expanded to many other forms of expressive and communicative cultural production. And today, I would like to turn my attention to one of those less recognized forms of indigenous media, tourist market handicrafts. In particular, I'll be speaking about a genre that has been developed by painters in the communities of Tigua in the highland province of Cotopaxi, Ecuador. The history of Tigua-style paintings illustrates many of the elements one finds in stories about the innovation of new souvenir craft forms around the world. It has its origins in the 1970s in the wake of expanded air travel and the boom in international tourism that this expansion triggered. Sales pitches and academic accounts alike trace the birth of this art form to the convergence of three important factors: a local craft tradition, a skilled innovator, and a well-placed, well-positioned outsider. Scenes like this one that I bought in the open-air market known as the Plaza de Ponchos in Otavalo during a visit in the summer of 2011 have their material and aesthetic origins in the decorated drums played during the celebration of Corpus Christi. In fact, this painting shows men playing such drums during the celebration, although the drums that they're playing here are not actually decorated. In the 1970s, and still today, it's common for the leather faces of these drums to display a simple drawing of the principal ritual figure at the center of celebrations. This guy. Possibly on the drums also with dancers or musicians to either side, and so we see those elements here too. The space around the figures was filled with flowing lines, and the sides of the drums were decorated with colorful geometric figures or floral designs. Today, the most common themes illustrated in Tigua-style paintings are still drawn from traditional rural culture and are executed on sheepskin stretched across a wooden frame, just like the drums that came before them. The initial folkloric elaboration and the first steps in the transition toward the paintings that appear in stalls at tourist markets today is typically credited to Julio Toaquisa. As the story goes, Julio was inspired to his art by an encounter with a shaman and a subsequent dream that caused him to paint a drum and take it with him to play during the Corpus Christi celebrations in Pujili. His drum attracted the attention of Olga Fish, a gallery owner and collector who bought the drum from him and went on to become an influential promoter of Tigua art and a strong influence in the early development of the genre. She and other dealers from outside Tigua encouraged the production of more portable items that would appeal to foreign collectors and tourists. Today, Tigua-style paintings may be found in tourist markets all over the highlands of Ecuador, in galleries and museum gift shops in Ecuador's major cities, and occasionally on display in museums in Ecuador and abroad. Whereas many of the more successful tourist craft traditions have helped to maintain communities by offering economic opportunities at home, this has not been the case for Tigua artists. Tigua is far off the main tourist circuits, and artists have been forced to travel in order to complete their sales. This is why the genre may be found in so many places around the country. Many artists find it more practical to establish homes in these disparate communities, and few successful artists remain in Cotopaxi, except in the small community that has grown up near the volcanic crater lake called Quilotoa, which attracts enough tourism to support a small market. A few words of explanation are in order with regard to the anthropology of art and the significance that one might find in tourist market arts and crafts. Anthropologists who have written about arts and crafts have often taken their lead from art critics and art historians. The anthropologist's contribution is to fold in a large measure of cultural relativism. They argue at length that the significance of a piece of art lies in its cultural context and must be judged from an insider's point of view. When their focus is aesthetics, they speak to the culturally defined codes by which producers and audiences make aesthetic judgments. When their focus is meaning, anthropologists similarly study that meaning in cultural context. When the focus is craftsmanship or construction, they investigate the culturally shaped modes for creating art. In his influential, posthumously published book called Art and Agency, Alfred Gell rejected this approach to art as essentially non-anthropological. Gell writes, quote, "The project of indigenous aesthetics is essentially geared to refining and expanding the aesthetic sensitivities of the Western art public by providing a cultural context within which non-Western art objects can be assimilated to the categories of Western aesthetic art appreciation. This is not a bad thing in itself, but it falls far short of being an anthropological theory of art production and circulation." Gell goes on to write, again I'm quoting, "The aim of anthropological theory is to make sense of behavior in the context of social relations. Correspondingly, the objective of the anthropological theory of art is to account for the production and circulation of art objects as a function of this relational context." It's a mouthful, but I'll try to expand on that. For Gell, artworks are extensions of the people who make them or cause them to be made, and the people who encounter them as an audience. They're extensions of personhood. He writes, again I'm quoting, "As a general rule, it is fair to say that indexes, from the spectator's point of view, only mediate personhood rather than possess it intrinsically. However, the personhood of the artist, the prototype, or the recipient can fully invest the index in artifactual form, so that to all intents and purposes it becomes a person, or at least a partial person. It is a congealed residue of performance and agency in object form, through which access to other persons can be attained, and via which their agency can be communicated." End quote. The key word in this statement is mediate. While Gell is seeking to convince his readers that artworks participate in the social realm very much like people do, as a result of being invested with the agency of those with whom they come into contact, I find that his strongest claim is that people gain access to the thoughts and intentions of others through the physical traces that those mental activities produce in the world around them. Art mediates personhood because it is partially through art that personhood can be identified and assessed. Herein lies the problem with Gell's complete rejection of aesthetic engagement with art as non-anthropological. The way in which people engage with each other through art is mediated by the content of artistic expression. And because access to the personhood of others is not immediate, misunderstandings and miscommunications have a tendency to proliferate. One of the ways that we recognize art as art is that it seems to be meaningful. It seems to provide access to the inner mental states of the person who created it. I see art and I want to know what it means. Or at the very least, I want to know what it tells me about the person who made it. And I assume that the person who made it is trying to communicate something. So I interpret. But how often do we actually get this right? I'm reminded here of the stencil graffiti that one may find all over the Willie Street neighborhood here in Madison and other places, including Library Mall right out the window here. One group of designs in particular stands out to me as meaningful. They are a series of soldiers in different poses who show up all over town. They seem to express a kind of irony. Whoever creates them tends to place them in visible but unnoticed places. They usually appear close to the ground and are often partially obscured. They're there to be seen by any passerby, but in order to see them, one has to look. And to me, they feel sort of insurgent. I like to try to get into the head of the person placing them around town and try to predict where the next will appear. But I'm also reminded of Shepard Fairey, a street artist and graphic designer who's now most widely known as the person behind the Hope and Change posters released in support of Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. Fairey's first fame, however, developed among the skateboarding community as a result of a sticker campaign called Obey Giant, featuring Andre the Giant.